Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson we've elected to entitle Unlocking and Unleashing the Positive Potential of Persecution. We don't know if that's all going to fit, but that's what we want to call it in the YouTube engine, the space they allot. But one of the things I've learned under God's guidance is to turn my cursings into blessing. Transformative potential does exist through His power and His guidance, and we can turn the persecutions, which are a fact of life, not only in the Christian life, but in human history. Persecution is the hostility or ill treatment directed towards someone because of what they identify with or identify as. So there is racial persecution, there is also religious and ideological persecution. Persecution is both individual and sometimes it is institutional. So as Christians, we really don't have a whole lot of state-sanctioned persecutions, but there are forces in motion which are coming that way and head in that direction, which is why we have to prepare for the institutional persecution, which could conceivably come in our lifetimes, not ruling anything out, by embracing the individual persecutions. The worst we really have to worry about is the benign persecution of ridicule and reproach from the world, but we want to approach the negative and turn it into something positive. Now, the fact of persecution exists because of human nature is what it is. People exploit others because they can, because they have leverage and they have the opportunity and they have the resources, and rather use it to lift others up, they tear them down. And this fact, the base motive, first off, we are going to be spending most of our time in the New Testament today, but we have to proceed with a brief history of persecution in Old Testament before we read. We're only going to read 2 verses from the Old Testament, but the Old Testament does begin, the Hebrew nation begins as a persecuted people. When they come down as a family, they blossom into a nation, into Egypt, under Joseph's prime ministership. But then eventually there arises a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and he is threatened by the number of people, the idea being that they could conceivably side with an invading army. They are foreigners by origin, so their loyalty is suspect. So what does the Pharaoh do who knew not Joseph? He enslaves them, and this lasts for some 400 to 430 years. And the persecution does continue even as they settle and claim as a redeemed people in the promised land. Throughout the period of Judges, they find themselves ensnared in the cycle of apostasy-induced oppression. So they had exchanged being a foreign people persecuted on someone else's native soil for being persecuted on their own native soil by foreign people, and this they had no one to blame but themselves. And David was one who laid the foundation for the monarchy. This is when the nation of Israel finally functioned and flourished as an independent state, free from external persecution. But there was individual and internal persecutions. The prophets, we're going to read of some of them. It was the fact of life that they were persecuted in land. And David went through individual persecution. He was a warrior. He had enemies, and he had insight and expertise. He was a winner. He was one who did not let his losses beat him. And remember, a man is not defeated when he loses. He is only defeated when he quits. So he alludes to the fact of life. There are several passages in Psalms where David prays for deliverance from the hands of his persecutors, but this one explains the fact of life, the base motive. In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursues the poor. They are caught by the schemes which they devise. So arrogance is because they can, because they are able, because the opportunity exists to exploit people who have less resources. That's why the wicked persecute the poor. They pursue them as a prey and try and take advantage of them and fleece them for their wool and take everything they have. So this is economic persecution. It's an oversimplification to suggest, I'm not trying to incite class warfare here, because you cannot build the rich up by tearing the poor down, but we should coexist in mutual harmony and not exploit someone because they can, and let it's an oversimplification to suggest that the rich man got fat by taking the poor. We just want to have the balanced perspective. Then in the New Old Testament, rather, we advance to the prophets who prophesied, not only experienced persecutions. This was their common fate and dilemma in the national period. First off, the rise of prophets was not testament to the righteousness of the covenant nation, but the wickedness therein. And Jeremiah writes much of the persecution, the personal persecution he experienced. He was rejected, despised, and ridiculed for the 40 years he ministered. He was not an evangelically successful. He was no mega church preacher, superstar, but he survives as a stalwart prophet because he preached and presented the word of Yahweh as it came to him. So Yahweh rewards the effort, not the outcome. He speaks of in the book of Lamentations and also Jeremiah, he describes the personal and the national as Jerusalem, his beloved, once the treasure of Israel's eye is reduced to a shadow of its former self. He speaks poignantly of the persecutions which are being visited upon there. But in 2011, he speaks of the reversal of the persecution. But Yahweh is with me like a mighty awesome one. Therefore my persecutors shall stumble and not prevail. They shall be greatly ashamed, for they have not acted wisely. An everlasting reproach, never to be forgotten. So they do not act, those who persecute God's people do not act wisely because they don't know who they are up against. We have a powerful ally who is, as Jeremiah describes him, mighty and awesome. That is an understatement to his power. And through his power, those who inflict injury and harm on us will stumble, and they will fall trap. They will be ensnared by their own designs. That is the way of the fallen nature David alluded to in the second half of the passage from Psalms we didn't really comment extensively upon. But the source of their shame is going to be everlasting. So the persecutions and the injuries and the insults and the offenses we experience are fleeting and ephemeral. There's no permanent damage caused by those who can harm the body, but the one who can harm the soul can do so eternally. So it comes down to a question of who do we fear and whose esteem do we covet, the world's or Yahweh's, because as we get into the New Testament, we learn that the world is not going to like us, even though we are trying to save it. We turn to the Sermon of the Mount for the Savior's useful instruction in the Beatitudes, the closing of them, which is paradox all the way down from start to finish. He really puts the spin and the 180 paradox on the blessing of persecution. He instructs his disciples, both present and future, "Blessed are those who persecuted for righteousness' sake, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So what we are persecuted for is the determining factor in whether we receive this reward of the kingdom of heaven. Persecuted for righteousness' sakes, that means we are not persecuted for our own sakes, because none of us are righteous. It is for his name's sake, that in his name, attached to his name is his quality, his character, and his cause. So when we bear the ridicule and reproach and the persecution, sometimes violence, for his name's sake, then we are working our way up to the kingdom of heaven, not to endorse a legalistic salvation formula. "Blessed are you when they reproach you and persecute you, when falsely say every wicked word against you, for my sake." So when someone is persecuting you in any shape, variety, or making up slander and libelous innuendo accusations against you, that is, the natural man does not equate that, or it does not figure into his calculation that is a blessing. But when it's for his name's sake, it becomes a blessing. We belong to the fellowship of suffering that Paul alludes to in Philippians 3:10. We are connected to the community of the persecution, and persecution is the seed which caused this church to grow. It's the seed which sustains us. It is in the furnace of affliction where quality Christians are made. "Rejoice and be glad, because your reward in the heavens is great. For in this way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So rejoice and be glad. Do not weep and mourn, even though you are on the receiving end of pain, because what awaits you in heaven is it's gonna wipe all the tears and turn the frown upside down, reverse the tears, and you are only following in the footsteps of the prophets. The prophets, it's a fact of life that, as I earlier mentioned, the rise of prophets in Israel was not testament to their righteousness, but because of their wickedness. And so they were frequently persecuted, the ones who were trying to save them. And it's a fact of human nature that he who exposes and denounces the evil is less liked by the purveyors and doers of evil than the evil they denounce. So that's always the cause. And he also adds this in the 44th verse of the same chapter. We're actually going to read it from the 43rd. You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So notice what he doesn't say. You heard that it was written. He is not appealing to authorized canonical authority, but an oral tradition, which were in currency at this time. The Pharisees had their own oral tradition, which added to and elaborated unauthorized the law of Moses. And they taught that it was okay to hate the enemy. This was from a misapplied and misrepresented interpretation of Psalm 139, where David identifies his enemies as those of Yahweh's, and his and Yahweh's enemies are the same, one and the same. So it's not our enemies that are worthy of our hatred and derision. It is Yahweh's enemy. But he turns it up and says, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those cursing you, do good to those hating you, and pray for those insulting you and persecuting you. So he takes the counterintuitive approach. We are the prayer. It is a spiritual law, as certain of the law of gravity, that you cannot remain angry at someone if you are praying in and with sincerity for their soul. So if someone, it's hard to pray for someone when they're punching you in the face, but once the punch lands its blow and you part ways. Pray for him. As extreme as this sounds, we are called to nothing but the highest ideals because he only wants the very best. This is the kingdom constitution, and these are the principles. Challenging as we are, loving our enemies does not make sense to the natural man. But that is the type of love that he commanded in Romans 5:10. We learn that he died for us while we were still God's enemies. And we are always going to be enemies of the world because the cross is the condemnation of the world. And much of the wisdom reflected in the Sermon of Mount is repeated in the writings of Paul and also the speech of Stephen, the first reference of which is 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10 through 12. Paul, there's also several words in the concordance about Paul, how he became he became what he once was, a persecutor. He had to suffer tremendous things, but he had reaped what he had sown in his defense. But he has a whole new outlook and perspective on persecution, having been on more than his receiving end of the experience which he once inflicted on others. Verse 10 to 12, for we are fools for the sake of Messiah, but you are wise in Messiah. We are weak, but you are strong. You are in esteem, but we are not appreciated. So the sake of Messiah is what gives the difference, because they are wise in the Messiah. They think they are wise, but they are not in his sake. And it's through the foolishness of the world that Yahweh shows the foolishness of worldly wisdom. And look at our world wisdom today. This is, has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Our best brains are geared towards constructive designs, and but the weakness and strength is another paradox. So there's a lot of paradoxes, and turning a blessing into a cursing is a paradox in itself, but one that doesn't make sense on surface value, but when dug underneath and unlayered, it does begin to make sense. Until the present hour we both hunger and thirst, and we are scantily clad, and beaten and homeless, and labor, working with our own hands. Being cursed, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffered. So the first, the litany of the list indicates his miserable physical and temporal condition. He was hungry, he was thirsty, he lacked the basic bodily necessities and luxuries. He was homeless. He didn't have a home to call his own. He worked a job without being paid for it. He was the most diligent apostle, and he did it all for evangelists who ever lived, and he did it all for free. But, the way he did turn the frown upside down was he was cursed. He was cursed because he brought he preached the cross. In Galatians, he writes, shall I suffer persecution for preaching the law? No, it is the cross which merits my persecution. And the cross, we have to carry our cross. This is one of the demands of the discipleship. And being persecuted, we suffer. Being insulted, we help. We have been made as the filth of the world, dirt wiped up until now. So even though he is despised and demeaned and dehumanized by the world itself, he considers the cause that he is with to reverse. It boils down to a question of faith. Whose faith and adulation and esteem do we want? The world's or his? And Romans 12:14, we actually missed that one now that I look at the list in its original arrangement. But we might have not even marked that one. We just got to find it. But this echoes much of what we read in the Sermon on the Mount, 14:12. Not quite, 12:14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. So Paul is echoing and repeating the counsel of the Master himself given on the Sermon on the Mount. This is how to overcome evil with good. So there is two forces in the universe which vie for control and dominance within us and around us, good and evil. And the way we overcome that evil is powerless to withstand the good. And what does the good do? It blesses those who persecute you and bless rather than curse. So even though they are inflicting cursing, they are saying curses on you, they are wishing curses, they are being curses, we bless them nevertheless. And the blessing is to be blessed, and to be a blessing is a blessing in itself. Acts 7:5-2, Stephen confirms the Master's observation that the prophets, it was the common fate of the prophets to suffer and be persecuted. So every time I come across someone who tells me they envy the prophets, I question whether they have read their stories and their biographies. Yes, it's an honor. Yes, it's a privilege. Yes, it's a mark of respect. But the price they paid was tremendous. And the prophet, there is nothing easy in the job description properly understood of the prophet. Which of the prophets did your father not persecute? And they killed those who before announced the coming of the righteous one, of whom you have now become the betrayers and murderers. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the ones who were in the temple, the Pharisees at least like to fancy themselves as respecter of the prophets. And Israel hadn't had a prophet in some 400 years, but they accepted the writings of the prophets as canonical. And the Master plainly indicts him in similar language to Stephen, or it elaborates on his observation that they were killing the prophets just like their ancestors. A greater than Jonah was here, and you are trying to kill him. You are not of your father Abraham, you are of your father the devil, he says in chapter 8. But it was just a fact of life, and they murder him for indicting them for persecuting prophets, and a prophet was in their midst. He was just giving them a history and telling them they had it all wrong. And when the promised Messiah had come, they had treated him disdainfully and reproachfully, just like the prophets of old who hadn't been on the scene for some time. But the apostles became the prophets, and they are guaranteed, we and they are by connection are guaranteed the enmity of the world in John 15:18-21. This is the upper room discourse, the parting farewell address, the final words of the Savior to the disciples, the final teachings. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before you. If you were of the world would love its own, but because you are not of the world, yet I choose you out of the world. For that reason, the world hates you. So when we belong to him, we will share in the hatred that the world hated him. The world that he had created rejected the Creator when he entered into the human form and knew him not, we read in John 1:10. So if it was the same for us, it's going to be the same for us. And the world here is the satanic system of culture and geopolitics, but we don't belong there. We are in the world, not of it. In it, but above it, but apart from it, yet in it. And as such, we have to coexist, and we should be reaching, we shouldn't be so, we have to keep our separation from the world, but not interpret the separation to the extreme, which suggests legalism. I mean, what's the word I was looking for? You know what, I forget. Remember the word, and I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they shall persecute you too. If you have kept my word, they would keep yours too. So if we honor, obey, and observe the word, the teachings, the commandments, the wisdom of him, they will persecute us because they persecuted him, and it was for these principles that he was persecuted. And he's reminding them that a servant is not greater than his master, and so that means he is not absolved of the unpleasant experience that the master that they latch themselves onto must go. But all this they shall do to you because of my name, because they do not know who sent me. So because of my name, the name once more is the controlling element. The name, there is strictly speaking no separation between the names and the beings of divinity. It is indicative of the character and function and cause by connection. And the reason they do this is because they are estranged from the ones they allegedly worship. They consider themselves sons of Yahweh, and the Savior said, no, you are of your father, the devil. But, just the fact that we have to expect persecution is addressed by Paul in 2 Timothy. I really didn't mark these as well as I thought. 2 Timothy 3:12, and indeed, all those wanting to live reverently in Messiah Yahshua shall be persecuted. So when we are persecuted and when we are punished, and some Christians still struggle with this. They think it's because they have done wrong, but we will be persecuted because we have done right. We will be dragged to jail without cause, without any legitimate pretext. That has happened to Christians throughout the ages, and worse. But if the world's going to mock us and belittle us and sneer at us, if we are trying to live for righteousness because they are in love with wickedness and testament to their wickedness, they will persecute us because they resent the righteous in their presence and the calls for righteous. Peter says, there's no reason not to expect this persecution. He addresses the fact of persecution in his first epistle extensively, and I recently did the whole range of that book, and sanctification through suffering is the theme I explored. Beloved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery trial that is coming upon you, to try you as though unusual matter has befallen you. So he's telling them what to expect, and this is the what they have to expect because they are in the world and they are Christians, and the world is at enmity with Christians, and he who is a friend of the world is at enmity with Elohim. Therefore, he who is a friend of the world is an enemy of him, we read in James 4:4. But the fiery trial, now that has connotations of the furnace of affliction. The furnace is a physical concept, which is the foundation of a metaphor. Much as gold has to be eliminated from dross and impurities, so too must Christians get things out of them, purge certain traits that can only come through discipline and punishment and persecution. So this is all under the care of providence, and God doesn't send anything for our long-term benefit, so we have to embrace and run with the persecutions that he sends our way. But as you share Messiah's suffering, rejoice, in order that you might rejoice exultingly at the revelation of his esteem. So how we respond, persecution is the immediate promise, but we have a greater and more everlasting promise, which awaits us if we endure to the end of our persecution, and that is eternal salvation in his proximate presence. So that is a cause for rejoicing even when we are suffering. We can sing a song to what awaits us. If you are reproached for the name of Messiah, bless, because the spirit of esteem and of Elohim rest upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is praised. So it is an act of blasphemy to attack God's people because they are God's people. That is an egregious assault because there's a revulsion against the things of God, the people of God, that which represents God, that of God himself, actually, in the world we live right now. So what is true in Peter's age is coming increasingly alive in our own, but we have the Spirit and who rests upon us. He resides in us, and we have the conviction and satisfaction that on our part we did not blaspheme, we did not dishonor the one in whose name we suffered, while they are by the very fact of their unmerited persecution that they are inflicting upon us. For do not let any of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or doer of evil or as a meddler. So if we find ourselves in prison because we did any of these things, we are there because we deserve it, and that is not suffering for his name's sake. That is the just retribution and consequence of your criminal activity. So suffering in itself is nothing good. It is suffering for the right cause and for the right purpose and for the right reason. But if being Christians, let him not be ashamed, but let him esteem Elohim in the matter. So the Christian has no cause to be ashamed, even though they are publicly humiliated. The natural man would be humiliated to be degraded in their shoes, and some of this was a lot worse for the first century Christian audience to whom he was writing, but their esteem was paradoxically exalted, and the theme of paradox is prominently. We're going to move to the final 3 verses, which give us a victorious outlook, especially, thus tying the theme of this lesson's intended title together. 2 Corinthians 12:10, Paul speaks of the thorn in his flesh, the physical handicap or infirmity, we don't know quite which one, that he requested 3 times in prayer to remove it. But God told him, no, I'm not going to remove it. And this was a messenger of Satan. He says, I'm going to keep it in you so the world can see that my grace is sufficient. Therefore, I take pleasure in weaknesses, in insults, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for the sake of Messiah. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So taking pleasure in the fact of our weakness, man is never so strong as when he is weak. Man is never so tall as when he is on his knees. That's a double paradox. Insults, I don't let insults bother me because words are not... They're not actually literally harmful. Their only harm is what you allow them to have. So if someone insults me personally, I can shrug it off. And if there is an element of constructive criticism in their insult, then I will embrace that and run with it. But in needs, no one wants to admit that they are needy, independent, in poverty, but we are all beggars. All the saints are beggars for Yahweh on our daily provisions. In persecutions, this is what we've been talking about the whole time. No one likes persecution. They are not pleasant, yet Paul takes pleasure in the fact that he is persecuted, if not in the persecution themselves, because that is a sign and a testimony to him that he is walking the way of righteousness and doing his job. And in distresses, but it's all for the sake of Messiah. Stress, the Christian life is not absolved of stress, but we do have perspective on our stress and our pains and our ails, because when we are weak, then we are strong. That is the paradox. When we are aware of our own impotence, we can lean on the inexhaustible and omnipotent strength from above and on high. 2 Thessalonians 1:4. Paul praises the Thessalonians whose rumor had reached him of their endurance and trial through persecution, so that we ourselves boast of you among the assemblies of Elohim for your endurance and faith in all your persecutions and afflictions which you are bearing. So Paul wrote in response because he had this positive rumor. Now there was some confusion among the Thessalonian assemblies, and there was a doctrine which instilled laziness, the one that taught that the second coming was coming, so there was no need to work. But on the whole, from the start, he has a praiseworthy mention for the second epistle to the Thessalonians, which is written 6 months after the first. This is the third chronologically earliest Pauline epistle after Galatians and 1 Thessalonians. The final one is in 2 Corinthians 4:8-12. Being hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, being perplexed, but not in despair, being persecuted, but not forsaken, being thrown down, but not destroyed, always bearing about in the body the dying of the Master Yahshua, that the life of Yahshua might also be manifest in our body. For we, the living, are always delivered to death for the sake of Yahshua, for the life of Yahshua might also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So that death is indeed working in us, but the life in you. So even though he's surrounded by every element in every corner by all these forces aligned against him, he is not crushed. He's keeping his feet forward. He is confused, but he does not succumb to discouragement. He doesn't know the mystery of what's going to happen to him by the day. He has to live with mystery, which is part of faith, and there is some perplexity in that. But he knows he's on the right path, and because he is there, he knows that when he is being persecuted, he's not being abandoned by Yahweh, but remains in his protective wings and under his protective arms. And, he did not quit, so he was thrown down often. He had a dozen and zillion experiences where lesser Christians would have thrown in the tile. Paul really went all the way, and he was not destroyed, he was not defeated, and he bore this to paradoxically die. It was a daily dying of self, and that is the path of discipleship, that of self-denial and taking up our cross. We are to die daily to bring and disperse life to others. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.